Okay, so everything now is clean. What I did do was I took the two 3x10x4 bearings, the original stainless steel bearings, out because my customer here wants to upgrade to the Boca bearings. Now, whenever you do a Boca bearing upgrade, you don't have to upgrade all of the bearings in your reel because not all of the bearing upgrades are going to make a difference. You do have to change out bearings, however, if they become seized up, which you can replace with factory bearings or regular stainless steel bearings. But in this case, the kit that Boca sells for the Curado K 201 HG and the 200 HG and almost all the K kits, from what I've looked up, is you only have to change out the two 3x10x4 bearings. Now, quick note, you do not have to put, or you should not put oil in the orange seal Boca bearings. They are designed to run dry. Some people like to take the orange seal off because they think it makes their reels faster, but this guy's going to be using these reels in salt water. I want to leave the seals in. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually to put those two bearings in place. So the first thing that I'm going to do is start to put the components back into the handle side plate on the outside. So that was a bearing this size, which I'm going to put a small drop of oil in, and then I'm going to work it back and forth to work that oil in a little bit. That goes in. Next was this white bushing. That goes in. And then one of the Boca bearings. This retainer clip holds this bearing in. Pop that in place. Put a small drop of oil on the spool tension cap. And screw that on. Next is the bearing that goes into the palm side plate. So I'm going to put this pressure plate back in. Make sure that it is lined up. I'm going to put a couple drops right in the center where the spool shaft is going to rub against that plate. I'm going to put that bearing in place and then put the retainer clip in place. And now those two pieces are done. So I can set those aside. I'm going to take the body of the reel and I'm going to start to reassemble everything. The first thing that I want to put on is the two wear plates, which will snap into place against the body of the reel. And you know which one goes where because if you remember that kind of hidden screw that was in here, there's actually a hole cut out in this wear plate for that screw. This wear plate goes on the other side. I'll snap that in. I'm going to open up my grease. Take a little Kids Arts and Crafts paintbrush that I like to use. And I'm just going to put a light coat of grease on these wear plates because that's where the thumb bar rubs. As well as just putting a little light coat on the body here, where some of that stuff is going to rub, we have to attach this plate that we took out. So I'm going to put this plate in place and screw those back down. Screw that back down. Actually, now that I've done that, I want to maybe take a minute to show you how I have everything organized. What I have is all the thumb bar and the cam brakes and that plate and those two screws, all of that are grouped together. All the worm gear stuff is grouped together. The drive shaft and drag system is together. I have my bearings, which you saw I had the two Boca bearings here too as well. And then everything that was involved in the handle, and these screws have to do with the side plates and the face plates. Next thing that I want to reassemble is the worm gear. So I'm going to take the worm gear shroud and the line guide, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to push that through and line that up on the opposite side. I'm going to push the worm gear itself through all the way. Put the brass ring so what I want to do is just put just a little drop of oil there. Push the E-clip in place. Now, inside of this cap is a little tiny washer. And that goes in between the pawl and the pawl cap. So I'm going to put the pawl in, then kind of go back and forth until you see that pawl fall into place. Put the washer in, a little bitty drop of oil, and then put the pawl cap on. I'm going to give it just a little bit of a tightening, but not too much. And you can see it runs back and forth okay. I'm going to take the pin and run it through the line guide into the opposite side. Make sure it goes through the line guide. So this faceplate has to come in at a little bit of an angle, and then it'll snap into place. Because there's a little knob that fits into a hole. So now that that's in place, I'm going to put the top plate on. And you have to make sure that the top plate on the handle side, the palm side, fits in between the frame and the faceplate. So my two short screws are going to hold the top plate on here and here. And then my screw for the faceplate goes where you made sure that the top plate fit in between goes here. Oops. Perfect. So my next step is going to be to put this thumb bar back on with this screw. But before I do that, I want to get a light coat of this grease using my brush and just kind of coat everything so that there's not much resistance and this plate will not wear out, because everything's going to be rotating and the kick out plate's going to be sliding on this plate. So you can see the groove here where that kick out arm slides around on that plate. So I'm going to put some grease. Make sure I put enough grease there. And then slide the top of the thumb bar inside those grooves and down and in. Oops. So that I can slide this plate through the thumb bar and onto the reel. I'm gonna put this screw in place, which is the black screw, small black screw. I need my smaller drive screwdriver. There we go. Perfect. Tighten that down. So now my thumb bar is in place. What I want to do next is to assemble most of the cam and brake system. So what I'm going to need to do, first, one of these larger bearings goes underneath that whole system. So I'm going to put a small drop of oil and then I'm going to roll it back and forth. Get that oil in there. I'm going to push that in place. There is a small ring that goes on top of that, but we can do that. That doesn't need to be immediate. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the kick out arm in place. Put the spring in. And then put the kick out arm on the spring. In line with where it goes. One of the things you want to make sure that you do is have the thumb bar up, all the way up. Now, it gets a little tricky. You got to be patient. Now that that's on, I'm going to start by getting this tab on to the kick out arm on the cam gear, on the cam, and then sort of press down and rotate a little bit until it kind of locks into place. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my fingers on it. I'm going to take that metal, that really, really thin silver washer, put that on top of the bearing, and then your post guard, your post goes on here. There's 2 screws. So let me hold this down, put the first screw in, and get the first screw started and down somewhat so that it holds it in place. Put the second screw in. Now I can screw these 2 screws down. So next, I'm going to take my yoke and flip it over. I want to put a little dab of grease on each one of the ramped angled sections. Flip it back over. Put the pinion gear in the yoke. And slide the yoke on the post in place. And this only works if the thumb bar is up. I'm not gonna put the screws on yet. I mean the springs on yet, because I want to reassemble the drive gear. So next we're gonna reassemble the drive shaft. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this little spring, push it through the hole. Oh, it fell out. Actually, I'm just gonna grab it with my tweezers, and I'm just gonna barely touch it to some grease. And put it in the hole. Then I'm gonna take the 2 white plastic pins, push the first one in, put my finger over it, push the second one in till they're about even, and then push the gear on so that what you're going to want to do is push that plastic gear on so that those 2 white tabs end up fitting inside of the corners of the square of this black plastic gear. So now that that's on, we have the drive shaft bearing, which I want to oil now. I'm going to put just a small drop, work it in. We have and so here's an example of having the schematic handy, because I want to make sure that I put everything on this reel the right way. So I'm going to go to the model, which is the 201 HG. Though I'm sure this is the same for all of them. So we're going to want to finish assembling this drive shaft. So the plate with the 2 screw holes goes next, then the bearing, and then there's these 2 metal washers, which are really just spacer washers, go on the bottom next, and then the E-clip goes into place, and that's what's going to hold all of this together. Snap that into place. Then that goes into the reel of the body, but what you want to do is kind of turn this gear so that the teeth line up well with the worm gear, and that the drive shaft goes all the way in. Excuse me. Give it a quick wipe. And so what you're going to want to do is take the drive shaft and put it in the body, lining up those two holes, but you also want to make sure that the teeth of the drive shaft line up with the gaps in the teeth of the worm gear here. And you also want to make sure that you push all the way down so that there's no gap in between the sections of the plate where the screw goes and the body of the reel where the threads are for the screws. Oops. I'm going to get this first one started. Make sure that this is lining up right. And then get the second one in. Oops. Tighten these down. And then I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to get some grease. And while I rotate, the drive shaft gear, I'm going to just kind of dab that grease onto the teeth so that it gets on both the drive shaft gear and the worm gear. You don't want to put too much. You don't want to be too liberal with it, but you do want to make sure that it gets on all of it. Now, the next thing that we need to do before anything falls off or flips out is we want to put this palm plate back on, which, if you remember, we tucked the E-clip here. So what I'm going to do is push that palm plate back through. Oh, I'm not even close. Push the palm plate back through. Make sure that everything lines up. Lock it in place. And then I'm going to put this E-clip in place and then snap it on. All right. So now that palm plate is in place, we're going to have to do a couple things here. I'm going to get my drive gear ready with my drag washers and my kick out gear. I'm going to put my kick out gear on first, make sure that it lands where it's grooved at squarely for the drive gear. Take my greaser here on the main drive gear, and I'm going to run a bead over the teeth, kind of trying to get it to go into the teeth a little bit. And then I'm going to run my finger over the grease, pushing it into the teeth as best as I can. without going over the sides. And what I'm going to want is for this grease to go about halfway around the drive gear. A little bit more is okay. Just kind of using the excess grease to maybe fill any gaps where some grease didn't land. And then what I'm going to do is just kind of rub it off of the edges here and off of the underneath. I'm going to set that down. And then I'm going to use my Cow's drag grease on my drag washers. So I get just about a fingerprint here, and I'm going to take the small drag washer and just rub it in and coat it. You don't want to put too much. Then we're going to want to put the drive gear on the drive shaft. And what I like to do is kind of put my finger on the pinion gear while I slide it on and pull back on the pinion gear a little bit. Let that drive shaft come down all the way. That drive gear come down all the way. Make sure there's no grease riding on the inside of that gear. Again, just a little fingerprint of grease. Rub that into this drag washer. This one was cleaned pretty thoroughly, so it was pretty dried out. There was no residual grease, so it needs a little bit, but you still don't want to over grease it. Put that in place. Get my Cow's out of the way. Put this top gear. Usually I'll take whatever residual Cow's drag grease is on. So this is keyed to fill in the drive shaft a certain way. So you slide that on. Now, here's where we're going to start to really get close to finishing the reel. I'm going to slide the drive shaft sleeve on, and if you notice it's geared, it's toothed. So those teeth fit inside of this top gear, and there's a spacer washer that goes on top. Put that spacer washer on top. Just put your 2 springs on your posts. And then you can slide the side plate onto the body. Just kind of being gentle with it, making sure that that sleeve fits in. Let me take this spacer washer out, actually, because that's not where I want it. It's going to go there, but it's going to go on after we put this plate on. So springs in place, everything's where it needs to be. So we're going to slide the plate on. Make sure everything lines up, pushes it on, and snap it into place. Now from here, we're going to start putting the screws in place. I know that I need to put these 2 screws in first so that I don't have to let go of anything or open anything back up. And where is the other one? here underneath the foot. So now that part is on, you can open the palm side plate. You can put the silver screw inside of that hole there, screw that down. When I close the plate back, and then inside of that thumb bar hole, that hidden screw that we couldn't find in the beginning, I'm going to screw that back on. Okay. So now that that's on, there is this bearing. Fits inside of here on the drive shaft. There was this spacer washer here. These two brass spacer washers were on top of that. And then you have your two external drag washers. Now if you notice, these drag washers have a curve to them or a bend to them, and how you want them to land on the drive shaft is like a set of parentheses facing each other with the middles kicked out like this. So you want them to look like a set of parentheses. So we'll put the first one on. And we'll put the second one on. So let me zoom in. So if you can see how they touch on the two outsides, and then there's a gap in the middle. So these two springs are going to push against each other. It's important that you put those on correctly. Next is this washer that has a brass side and a felt side. The brass side goes down facing the inside of the reel, and the felt side is going to touch this nut. And so again, this is going to be opposite threaded, so it's lefty loosey. I'm going to tighten that down by hand till it gets to till it touches. Now right here, because it's going to make things a lot easier, this is when I put the spool back in. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little drop of oil on the shaft of each one of these brakes, and then use a swab that has some oil on it. Now I'm going to run it around the edge and on the inside of each side of the spool. So I'm going to put that spool in. I'm going to close the palm side of the plate. Make sure that I flip that close switch. So next is going to be this big spring, the drag star. Now remember, this has a spring underneath it. So I'm going to hold the drag star in place. I'm going to put the handle on, hold the handle in place, and then screw this nut on. Now remember, again, this piece, this nut is going to be opposite threads. And you want to make sure that you don't cross thread it. So I'm gonna tighten down this nut the other way, opposite way, because it's left-handed threads, and then see if this nut cap lines up, which it does. Put the screw in. Now, the reel is completely assembled, but we have one thing left to do as far as servicing, and that's getting grease inside of this worm gear. And so what I do is I take my greaser and I push the tip of it up against the worm gear and start to squeeze the grease in it. I'm trying to get it in a place where you can see it in the light, but there's no way to stop the shadows. And then I'll turn the handle slowly to start to work that grease in, filling in any gaps where I don't see any grease. And then just keep working it in. But turn it slowly. Don't turn it fast when you first get started. Turn it slowly. You need the chance for all the grease inside of the reel that you just put to work itself everywhere it needs to go. And so what I'm going to do is just I'm going to tighten down the drag a little bit, then back it off, and then I'm going to slowly turn this handle. Just kind of checking out how everything's doing tension wise on the spool. And I'm just gonna excuse me, I'm just gonna keep turning this handle slowly, and I'm gonna do this for a minute or so. So here's the Boca bearings, still spinning, if you can hear it. That's pretty good. And that's it. That's a Curado K 201 HG. Done.